What if a single act of kindness could rewrite your entire future? On a frigid morning in Chicago, a young black man named Malik Evans, an orphan with nothing but grit, trudged through icy streets toward a job interview that could change everything. His shoes, tattered, peeling, barely holding together, threatened to unravel his dreams before he even stepped through the door. But then, a stranger's voice cut through the wind. An older white man, a street cobbler named Henry Brooks, offered to mend them for free. No strings attached, just pure kindness. That moment lit a spark in Malik, one that would burn for years. What keeps you pushing forward when the odds feel stacked against you? Malik stood in the dim bathroom of Hope Haven Shelter, staring into a cracked mirror that reflected a face etched with determination and doubt. His second-hand white shirt, ironed with a damp towel and sheer will, clung too tightly to his neck, the sleeves stopping just above his wrists. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. He adjusted the navy blue clip-on tie borrowed from Pastor Marcus, giving himself a final look that lingered on the imperfections he couldn't fix. His gaze dropped to his shoes, leather peeling like old paint, stitching frayed at the toes, soles flapping with every step. The laces? A piece of old telephone wire, knotted in a desperate attempt to hold them together. These shoes had carried him through job fairs, community college halls, and endless walks home in the dark, their worn soles a map of his struggles. They were all he had, and today, they felt like a betrayal. At 23, Malik had just graduated with an economics degree from Chicago Community College, the only one from his group at Hope Haven to escape the pull of a police record or shattered dreams. He'd grown up in foster care, losing both parents before he was 7, bouncing between group homes and shelters where kindness was scarce and survival was a daily fight. Despite the hunger, the fights, the odds stacked against him, he'd survived. More than that, he'd fought for better, studying late into the night, staying clean, earning a scholarship for kids aging out of the system. No one had handed him anything. He'd built his future from scraps, piece by painstaking piece. Now, stepping into the biting January air, Malik clutched a plastic folder with his resume and a single recommendation letter, holding it like a lifeline against the wind that curled through the south side streets like a warning. The city roared around him, honking cars, the screech of the L train overhead, the chatter of rushed commuters, but in his mind, everything was silent. Each step echoed too loudly, his shoes whispering a story of struggle he feared the world could hear. Imagine you're Malik, standing on that icy street, your future hanging in the balance. Would you keep walking, hoping no one notices your shoes, or stop and let Henry fix them, risking being late but gaining a moment of hope? Share your choice in the comments, number 1 or number 2, and let's see what you do. Before we continue, please help us reach 1,000 subscribers on Daily Narrated Stories. We're so close, and your support means the world to us. Hit that subscribe button and join our community for more stories that inspire and uplift. Let's keep this journey going together. Malik was halfway to the train station when a voice stopped him cold. "You can't step into your future like that, young man." The tone was gruff but warm, like a fire crackling on a winter night, cutting through the icy wind that stung his cheeks. He turned to see an older white man, maybe 60, sitting on a folding stool beside a weathered cart, its wheels rusted from years of Chicago winters. The man wore layers of faded denim, a patchwork of patches on his jacket, and his hands were wrapped in fingerless wool gloves. Gripping a worn leather boot, he was mending with a kind of reverence. A small, hand-painted sign leaned against the cart. "Henry Brooks, Repair and Restore." If you can, Henry squinted over scratched glasses, their lenses foggy from the cold, and pointed at Malik's feet with a calloused finger. "Those shoes are crying out. That's not leather squeaking. That's your future begging for mercy." He grinned, a lopsided smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and patted a crate in front of him. "Come here. I won't charge you. It ain't right to let someone chase hope on a broken soul." Malik hesitated, his breath visible in the frigid air, curling like smoke. People rushed past, their coats flapping, briefcases swinging, none sparing a glance at the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. His instinct screamed to keep moving. He couldn't be late for the interview that could change his life. But something in Henry's voice, sharp yet sincere, felt like a tether to a memory he couldn't place. It reminded him of a foster father he'd had for a brief 6 months when he was 9. A man who'd taught him how to tie a proper knot, who'd said, "A good knot holds everything together, even when the world's falling apart." That man had vanished from his life as quickly as he'd appeared, but Henry's voice carried the same quiet strength. Malik's eyes darted to the L train tracks above, the metallic screech of an approaching train a harsh reminder of the ticking clock. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and hope. Fear that he'd miss his chance. Hope that this moment might mean something more. He glanced at his watch, 7:32 a.m. He had 28 minutes to get to Stridewell's shoes, and the train ride alone would take 15. Could he risk it? His shoes, though, they were a liability. The soles flapped with every step, the makeshift laces barely holding. What if he tripped on his way into the building? What if the interviewer saw them and dismissed him before he even opened his mouth? The doubts swirled like the wind around him, biting at his resolve. He took a tentative step toward Henry, then another, until he was standing beside the crate. "You sure you don't want anything for this?" Malik asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile moment. Henry shook his head, his gray eyes softening. "I've been where you are, kid. Not exactly, but close enough. You're walking a road I know, hope on one side, despair on the other. I can't fix the whole journey, but I can fix the shoes that'll get you there." Malik sat, the crate creaking under his weight, and handed over his shoes with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. He'd learned early in foster care not to trust kindness. It often came with a price. But Henry's hands moved with a purpose that felt honest, and Malik let himself exhale, just for a moment. Henry pulled out a curved needle, a spool of waxed thread, and a small metal clamp, arranging them on the cart with the precision of a surgeon. His movements were fluid, practiced, as if he'd stitched 1,000 stories back together. Malik watched in silence, the rhythmic pull of the needle through leather oddly soothing against the chaos of the morning. The air smelled of damp pavement and burnt coffee from a nearby diner, and the faint hum of the city buzzed around them. Henry's cart was a small island of calm in the storm, a sanctuary Malik hadn't expected to find. "Interview?" Henry asked, not looking up, his focus on the shoe in his hands. Malik nodded, then realized Henry couldn't see him. "Yeah, entry-level job at a shoe company, of all places." Henry chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Funny how life works, isn't it? Shoes carry us through everything, but we only notice them when they fall apart." Malik studied the man's face. Deep lines etched like a map of hard years, a nicotine-stained beard, burn marks on the sleeve of his jacket, faded scars on his knuckles. A man who'd known heat and pressure, Malik thought. A man who understood survival in a way that went beyond words. "You from around here?" Malik finally asked, his curiosity outweighing his caution. Henry shrugged, his shoulders hunching slightly, as if the question carried a weight he wasn't ready to share. "Everywhere and nowhere. Had a shop on 63rd once, back when this city still cared about craftsmanship. Lost it when rents skyrocketed, long before folks started caring about old leather and honest soles. Now I fix what I can, when I can." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, his hands paused, the needle hovering over the shoe. Malik sensed a story there, one Henry wasn't ready to tell, but the silence spoke volumes. Henry's gaze grew distant, his fingers tracing the edge of the shoe as if it held a memory. "I had a daughter once," he said softly, so quietly Malik almost missed it. "She'd be about your age now. Loved shoes. Always wanted the shiny ones, even when we couldn't afford them. I'd fix her little sneakers with whatever I had, just to see her smile. But life takes things away sometimes." He didn't elaborate, and Malik didn't press. The weight of Henry's words hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Malik thought of his own parents, gone before he could really know them, and a pang of shared loss tightened his chest. He wanted to ask more. What happened to her? Where is she now? But the moment felt too fragile, like a thread that might snap if pulled too hard. Henry shook his head, as if shaking off the memory, and returned to his work. He cleaned the toe cap with a rag that smelled faintly of oil, pressed the peeling leather back into place, and began to stitch with a steady hand. Malik's mind drifted as he watched, the cold seeping into his bones despite the thin socks on his feet. He remembered a night years ago, sleeping in a group home, his shoes stolen by another kid. He'd walked barefoot to school the next day, feet bleeding on the icy pavement, shame burning hotter than the cold. The other kids had laughed, their taunts echoing in his ears. "Where's your shoes, foster boy?" That memory clawed at him now, whispering doubts louder than ever. What if they see your shoes and turn you away? What if you're not enough? What if you've come this far just to fail? But Henry's steady hands pulled him back to the present. The older man tied off the last stitch with a small, satisfied nod, then lifted the shoe gently, as if it were a living thing. "All right, let's see if she walks," he said, sliding the shoe onto Malik's foot. He tightened the makeshift laces, his fingers deft despite the cold, and tapped the heel with a light pat. Malik stood, stepping forward, then backward, testing the ground beneath him. The shoe held. No flapping, no give, just a quiet solidity that felt like a promise. Henry's smile was slow, satisfied, lifting the weight from his weathered shoulders. He looked up at Malik, his gray eyes clearer than before, and said, "Don't let those shoes stop you from walking the right path. Keep going. The rest of your life will meet you there." Malik felt the words settle in his chest, warm and heavy, like a cup of hot tea on a winter morning. They were more than advice. They were a lifeline, a reminder that someone, even a stranger, believed he could make it. He nodded slowly, his throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling too small for the moment. Henry just waved a hand, his glove fraying at the edges. "Get going. Dreams don't wait." Malik turned and began walking again, his shoes quiet now, his heart a little louder. He didn't look back, but he felt something shift, a piece of his story stitched together, stronger than before. The city seemed less hostile now, the wind less biting, as if Henry's kindness had carved a small space for hope in the morning's harshness. He reached Stridewell Shoes with just 4 minutes to spare, his breath coming in short bursts from the brisk walk. The building towered above him, all glass and steel, a world apart from the gritty streets he'd grown up on. Its polished surface reflected the gray sky, a mirror of wealth and ambition that felt both intimidating and alluring. He paused at the revolving doors, catching his reflection in the black glass, a young man in a too-tight shirt and a borrowed tie, clutching a plastic folder like a shield. Then he looked down at his shoes. The stitching was visible but solid, the soles firm, the leather gleaming faintly from Henry's care. They looked honest, and for the first time in a long time, Malik didn't feel the need to hide them. Inside, the lobby was sterile, the air thick with the scent of lemon cleaner and corporate ambition. The floor gleamed like a frozen lake, reflecting the sharp clicks of expensive shoes as people moved with purpose. Executives in tailored suits, assistants with earpieces, all part of a world Malik had only dreamed of entering. He stepped forward, his own shoes quieter but no less determined, and gave his name at the reception desk. The woman behind the counter, her hair pulled into a tight bun, barely glanced at him, her fingers tapping impatiently on the keyboard. "Take a seat over there," she said, pointing to a row of leather chairs near the elevator bank. Malik sat, his hands gripping the plastic folder in his lap, the edges of the paper inside crinkling under his fingers. Around him were 3 other applicants, 2 men and a woman, all older, their appearances polished in a way that made Malik feel like an imposter. They wore tailored jackets, their shoes gleaming like they'd never touched a city sidewalk. One of the men, a tall guy with a slicked-back haircut, glanced at Malik's shoes and smirked, a small, cutting gesture that felt like a blade against Malik's already fraying confidence. Then the man went back to scrolling on his phone, as if Malik wasn't worth another second of his attention. Malik's jaw tightened, but he ignored it. He had no time for someone else's judgment to define him. Yet the doubts crept back, louder now, a chorus of insecurities that had followed him through every group home, every rejection, every night he'd gone to bed hungry. What if they see through you? What if you're just the kid from the shelter, pretending to belong? What if all this effort, your degree, your scholarship, your dreams, ends here, in a glass building where you'll never fit? He closed his eyes for a moment, picturing Henry's steady hands, hearing his words, "Don't let those shoes stop you." He exhaled slowly, the air shuddering out of him, and adjusted his tie, the clip-on feeling like a child's toy against the sleek professionalism around him. He waited, each second stretching into eternity, the hum of the lobby's air conditioning a constant reminder of how out of place he felt. When his name was finally called, Malik Evans? He stood with a quiet resolve, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the receptionist could hear it. He followed the HR assistant, a young woman in a pencil skirt, through a maze of glass hallways, the walls reflecting distorted versions of himself with every step. They reached a small conference room lined with windows, the morning light filtering through in sharp, cold streaks. 3 interviewers sat waiting, 2 women and 1 man, all in crisp business attire, their smiles sharp and professional, like they'd been carved from the same glass as the building. The woman in the center, her hair a sleek bob, extended a hand. "Mr. Evans, thanks for coming in." Malik shook their hands, his palms sweaty despite the cold, and managed a steady, "Thank you for the opportunity." He sat, the chair creaking slightly under him, and placed his folder on the table, its plastic sheen a stark contrast to the polished wood. The interview began with standard questions: background, education, skills, experience. Malik answered clearly, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. His degree from Chicago Community College, the warehouse jobs he'd taken to afford meals, his work ethic forged through years of having no safety net, no family, no excuses. He spoke of nights studying by the dim light of a shelter lamp, of waking at 4 a.m. to walk miles to job fairs, of the scholarship that had felt like a lifeline when he'd aged out of foster care. The interviewers nodded, their expressions neutral, but Malik could feel their scrutiny, like they were peeling back his layers to see if he'd crack. Then came the harder question, the one that made his heart stutter. The man on the panel, a middle-aged guy with a silver tie and a stern jaw, leaned forward. "Why Stridewell? We get hundreds of applicants every month. What makes you the right fit?" Malik's hands tightened on his folder, the plastic crinkling under his fingers, then relaxed. He could play it safe, give the answer he'd rehearsed, something about brand alignment, long-term growth, upward mobility. Or he could tell the truth, the raw, unfiltered version that burned in his chest. He chose honesty, his voice low but firm. "Because I know what it's like to walk through life with your shoes falling apart." A pause hung in the air, heavy and electric. The panel exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Malik pressed on, his words gaining strength. "I don't just mean literally, though mine were until an hour ago. A man on the street, Henry, fixed them for free. Didn't ask for anything. He just said, 'Don't let your shoes stop you from walking the right path.' I'm here because I want to build shoes that carry people forward, not hold them back. People like me, who've never had a comfortable step in their life. I know what a good pair of shoes can mean when you've got nothing else." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, thick with unspoken thoughts. The woman in the center tapped her pen slowly against the table, the sound a metronome to Malik's racing heartbeat. Then she spoke, her voice measured. "You're talking about empathy then?" Malik nodded, his throat tight. "I'm talking about purpose. If I'm working in the back, stacking boxes, or tracking inventory, I want to know the products we make aren't just for people who can afford $500 sneakers. I want to help real people stand taller." Another silence followed, this one deeper, more profound, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The man with the silver tie leaned back in his chair, his stern expression softening slightly. "Well," he said quietly, "you've given us more than a resume to consider." The rest of the interview shifted, less formal, more curious. They asked how he'd handle pressure, and Malik spoke of nights in the shelter when he'd had to mediate fights to keep the peace. They asked about improving warehouse logistics, and he described a system he'd devised in a previous job to track inventory with limited resources. They asked about supply chain ethics, and he shared his belief that every product should serve a purpose beyond profit, that companies owed something to the communities they touched. He wasn't trying to impress, only to be seen, not as a risk, but as someone who understood the ground level in a way they couldn't. By the end, they stood and shook his hand again, their grips firm but warmer than before. No promises, just professionalism, but Malik saw something in their eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even respect. He stepped out of the building 30 minutes later, the cold air hitting him again, but this time it didn't bite. He walked down the same street he'd come up that morning, his shoes firm against the pavement, his shoulders back. Whatever happened next, call or no call, he knew one thing for certain. He had not walked in there ashamed, and he had not walked out the same man. For 2 weeks, Malik waited, the uncertainty gnawing at him like a hungry dog. He went through the motions at Hope Haven, helping younger kids with their homework, fixing a leaky faucet in the communal bathroom, sharing meals of watery soup and stale bread. But his mind was elsewhere. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leapt, only to sink when it was a spam call or a reminder from Pastor Marcus about the shelter's weekly prayer meeting. He replayed the interview in his head, dissecting every word, every glance. Had he been too honest? Too raw? Had his shoes, even repaired, marked him as someone who didn't belong? The doubts were relentless, a storm he couldn't outrun. The call finally came on a Tuesday afternoon, as Malik sat in the shelter's small computer lab, helping an older resident named Mr. Thompson set up an email account. "You gotta click there, see?" Malik said, pointing at the screen, his voice patient despite the restlessness in his chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket, an unknown number flashing on the screen. His heart stopped, then raced, a frantic rhythm that made his hands tremble. He hesitated, glancing at Mr. Thompson, who waved him off with a gruff, "Go on, answer it. I'll figure this out." Malik stepped into the hallway, the linoleum floor cold beneath his socks, and answered with a cautious, "Hello." The voice on the other end was professional, clipped but warm. "Mr. Evans, this is Sarah from Stridewell Shoes. We're pleased to offer you the position of logistics assistant in warehouse operations, starting Monday at 8 a.m. Malik's breath caught, the words washing over him like a wave. The pay wasn't much, but it came with benefits, transit reimbursement, health coverage, and most importantly, a foothold in a world he'd only dreamed of entering. He listened as Sarah outlined the details, his mind racing with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. When she finished, he managed a quiet, "Thank you. I won't waste it." He hung up and stood there for a long moment, the old tile floor beneath his feet feeling suddenly steadier, as if the world had shifted and clicked into place. He pressed his back against the wall, the peeling paint rough against his shirt, and let out a shaky laugh, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. He'd done it. Against all odds. Foster care, hunger, the statistics that said he'd never make it. He'd taken the first real step toward a future he could build. On his first day, Malik arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks he'd bought from a thrift store over the weekend. His shoes, Henry's handiwork, were polished with a borrowed rag and coconut oil, a trick someone at the shelter had sworn worked better than any store-bought shine. The coconut oil left a faint, sweet scent on his hands, a small comfort as he walked through the employee entrance, nodding at the security guard with a confidence he was still learning to feel. The warehouse was a world of motion, forklifts humming like bees, crates towering like skyscrapers, labels whirring through machines like ticker tape in a stock exchange. The air smelled of rubber and cardboard, a gritty contrast to the polished lobby he'd seen on interview day. Malik was assigned to a supervisor named Elena Torres, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a sharp gaze and a clipboard that seemed glued to her hand. She didn't have time for pleasantries, her voice brisk as she showed him how to scan packages, track shipments, and process returns. "Keep up, Evans," she barked when he fumbled with the scanner, but there was no malice in her tone, just expectation. The work was detailed and physical, the kind that made your back ache and your mind sharpen at the same time. Malik's hands moved quickly, learning the rhythm of the warehouse, but his thoughts kept drifting to Henry. That moment on the street had led him here, to this humming, chaotic space where he could finally build something. By the end of the week, Malik had earned a small nod of approval from Elena. She pulled him aside on Friday afternoon, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You're not just here for the paycheck, are you?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Malik smiled. A small, tired smile that carried the weight of his journey. "No, ma'am. I'm here so I never have to go back to where I came from." Elena's expression softened, and she gave a curt nod. "Good. Keep that fire. It'll take you far." Malik poured himself into the job with a determination that surprised even him. He stayed late when others clocked out, organizing shelves no one had asked him to touch, the dust on the boxes coating his fingers like a badge of honor. He fixed labeling errors that had gone unnoticed for months, his pen scratching corrections in the dim light of the warehouse after hours. When a delivery was delayed due to a snowstorm, He spent hours on the phone with a regional center, rerouting it through a smaller hub without being told. Small things, but they added up, each one a brick in the foundation he was building for himself. He made a point to learn names. Tony, the forklift driver who always had a joke ready. Marissa, the cleaner who brought her kids' drawings to show off. Jamal, the inventory clerk who dreamed of opening a barbershop. Malik remembered birthdays, bringing a pack of cupcakes for Marissa's daughter's 5th, and asked the cleaning staff how their families were doing. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because every minute on that floor felt like it meant something, like he was earning the right to keep walking the path Henry had set him on. The warehouse became his proving ground, a place where he could rewrite the story his shoes had once told. 6 months in, Malik pitched an idea during a team huddle, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. The company had been throwing out damaged returns, shoes that were slightly scuffed or had misprinted logos, but were otherwise perfectly wearable. Malik proposed creating a reclaim rack where employees could volunteer to clean and sort salvageable pairs, then donate them to local shelters and youth programs. He'd seen too many kids at Hope Haven go without proper shoes, their sneakers held together with duct tape, their toes poking through holes. "We can make a difference," he said, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I'll run it myself on weekends if I have to." The idea was met with polite nods, then silence, the kind that made Malik's stomach drop. Had he overstepped? 2 days later, he was called into a meeting with an executive he'd never met before, Clara Bennett, head of community development. She sat across from him in a small office, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a notepad in front of her. "Explain your plan again," she said, her tone neutral but curious. Malik took a deep breath, his hands sweaty as he laid out the details: volunteers, partnerships with nonprofits, a database to track donations. He spoke of the kids he'd grown up with, the ones who'd walked to school in the snow with no soles, the ones who'd never had a chance to stand tall. Clara listened, her pen tapping lightly against the pad, then leaned back in her chair. "Let's pilot it," she said finally. "You get 3 months." Malik threw himself into the program with a ferocity that left him exhausted but fulfilled. He worked nights after his shifts, his eyes burning from staring at a borrowed laptop as he set up a simple database to track the shoes. He partnered with local nonprofits, walking miles to their offices to pitch the idea in person, his repaired shoes a quiet reminder of why he was doing this. He recruited volunteers. Tony and Marissa signed up first, their enthusiasm a spark that kept him going. He got corporate to approve transportation for the donated goods, negotiating with a logistics manager who initially scoffed at the idea. By the end of the quarter, over 700 pairs of shoes had been redistributed across the city, each pair a small victory that felt like a shout against the odds Malik had faced. The impact was real, visible, measured in the smiles of kids who ran to show off their new sneakers, in the thank you notes from shelter directors, in the way Malik's co-workers began to look at him, not just as the new guy, but as someone with ideas worth hearing. Promotions didn't come overnight, but they came, each one a testament to his grit: logistics coordinator, inventory lead, assistant manager. With each new title, Malik brought the same drive to serve both the business and the people it touched. He suggested changes to the tracking software that shaved days off supply turnaround times, his late-night brainstorming sessions fueled by black coffee and determination. He rewrote the onboarding handbook for new hires to be clearer, fairer, ensuring no one felt as lost as he had on his first day. He advocated for a bilingual signage system in the warehouse to support Spanish-speaking workers, remembering how language barriers had isolated some of his foster siblings. And he never stopped wearing his first pair of repaired shoes on Fridays, a quiet promise to himself to never forget where he'd started. Years passed, each one a chapter in Malik's transformation. The company changed, and so did he. He moved out of Hope Haven, first to a tiny studio apartment where the radiator clanked all night, then to a better one with a view of the Chicago skyline, a sight that felt like a dream he was still learning to believe in. He started mentoring interns, most of them kids who reminded him of the boys from Hope Haven, kids with fire in their eyes but scars on their hearts. He'd sit with them during lunch breaks, sharing stories of his own struggles, telling them about Henry and the shoes that had changed everything. "You're enough," he'd say, his voice firm, hoping they'd hear the truth in it the way he'd needed to. He went back to school at night for an MBA, his evenings a blur of textbooks and energy drinks, the glow of his laptop the only light in his small apartment. He kept a photograph of his graduation day in his locker at Stridewell, himself alone on stage, holding the diploma like it was a living thing, his smile wide, but his eyes haunted by the absence of family to share the moment with. Then, 10 years to the day after he'd first stepped into that interview room, Stridewell launched a new product line. The Step Forward line, a durable, affordable, stylish line of shoes designed specifically for working-class communities, school districts, and disaster relief efforts. Malik had led the team that designed it, built the distribution network, and secured the outreach partnerships, pouring every ounce of his experience into making sure these shoes would mean something to the people who needed them most. At the product launch, the CEO called him one of the clearest examples of what the company stood for, his voice booming through the auditorium as cameras flashed and people clapped. But Malik's mind was elsewhere, adrift in the memory of a cold morning, a folding stool, and a man with a needle and thread. All he could think about was Henry, the man who'd started it all with a simple act of kindness. The applause faded into a distant hum, and Malik's chest tightened with a longing he couldn't ignore. It was time to find the man who'd helped him take that first real step. For weeks after the launch of the Step Forward line, Malik couldn't shake the ache in his chest, a quiet echo of unfinished gratitude that kept him up at night. The speeches were done, the photos published in industry magazines, the praise humbling but fleeting. What lingered was the face he hadn't seen in a decade, the voice that had lived inside his head like a compass. Don't let those shoes stop you from walking the right path. He tried to find Henry in the early years, back when his title still read coordinator and his bank balance barely covered rent. But leads had dried up, names turned fuzzy, memories faded like old photographs. The corner on 53rd had been swallowed by a new organic grocer, its glass storefront a stark contrast to the stoop where Henry had once patched soles. That stoop was now blocked off by scaffolding and city permits, a sign reading future site of luxury condos mocking Malik's efforts to hold onto the past. At the time, it had felt like trying to chase smoke, and life had kept moving. Promotions, projects, the relentless march of time. But now, 10 years in, something in Malik refused to let it go. The ache had become a fire, a need to close the circle that Henry had opened. He cleared his schedule on a Saturday, the first free day he'd had in months, and started over, tracing the city with his feet like a map etched in memory. He returned to 53rd in the early light, the street quieter than he remembered, the air crisp with the promise of fall. He stood where Henry's cart had been, the pavement worn but empty, and waited, hoping against hope that the past might step out of the shadows. No one appeared. The grocer's neon sign buzzed faintly, a reminder of how much had changed. Malik's throat tightened, a mix of frustration and longing threatening to choke him. What if Henry was gone for good? What if he'd never get to say the thank you that had been burning inside him for a decade? He walked 2 blocks east, his repaired shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the sidewalk, and began asking around. At a barber shop, an old man with a graying afro squinted at him over a pair of scissors. A white guy who fixed shoes? Yeah, I remember someone like that. Had a cart, real polite, always humming some old jazz tune. Disappeared a while back, maybe 5-6 years ago. Malik's heart sank, but he pressed on, walking to a bus terminal where a ticket agent recalled seeing a man matching Henry's description. Used to hand out shoes to kids during the winter, the agent said, her voice softening. Saw him give a pair to a teenager once, right before a big snow. Said he might have been connected to a shelter downtown. Malik followed the thread, his steps quickening with each new clue, his pulse racing with a mix of hope and fear. He stopped at shelters, churches, warming centers, asking for any records under the name Henry Brooks. The faces he met were weary, case managers with overworked eyes, volunteers who'd seen too many come and go. No one had a full answer, but each vague recollection kept him going. At a soup kitchen on 63rd, a cook with a missing tooth finally gave him a direction. Try the outreach clinic on Holstead, she said, stirring a pot of watery stew. They work with folks like that, quiet ones, used to have pride but lost the structure. Malik thanked her, his voice tight with emotion, and headed to Holstead, the name a beacon in the fog of his search. It took 3 more weekends of walking, of scanning weathered faces on street corners, of talking to case managers with overstuffed files and tired eyes. Each dead and felt like a punch to the gut, the fear growing that he'd never find Henry, that the man who'd changed his life had slipped away forever. One afternoon, just as he was about to leave the community center on Holstead, his shoulders slumped with defeat, a staffer called out behind him. "Wait, you looking for Henry?" Old guy, about 60, well, probably 70 now, used to fix shoes. Malik turned slowly, his heart pushing against his ribs like it remembered before his brain could catch up. "Yes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Him, the staffer, a young woman with a clipboard and a tired smile, nodded. "He volunteers on Thursdays, teaches a trade workshop for guys re-entering society after prison. Real quiet, real precise. You'd never guess he was on the streets a few years ago." Malik's breath caught, a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked him over. He thanked her, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets, and left, the promise of Thursday a lifeline he clung to through the long days that followed. That Thursday, Malik returned to the community center, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. What if Henry didn't remember him? What if the years had changed him too much? The room smelled of leather and coffee, a comforting warmth against the chill outside. 6 folding tables were scattered with men working on shoes, boots, and scraps of fabric, their hands moving with a focus that spoke of second chances. At the far end stood a man in a tan work jacket, his silver hair tied back at the nape of his neck, bent over a cracked pair of boots. He threaded a curved needle with the same practiced patience Malik had watched 10 years ago, his movements unchanged despite the lines that now etched deeper into his face. Malik walked across the room slowly, each step heavy with memory, the air thick with the scent of leather polish and the murmur of quiet conversations. He felt like he was moving through water, the world slowing around him as he approached. Henry looked up mid-stitch, his gray eyes squinting through the soft fluorescence, and stared. For a moment, there was nothing, no smile, no recognition, just a stillness that made Malik's chest ache. Then the needle slipped from Henry's fingers, clattering softly against the table, and his face broke into a look of pure, unguarded wonder. "Kid," Malik smiled softly, the word kid a bridge across the years. "Not a kid anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But yeah, it's me." Henry's face softened with realization, his eyes tracing Malik's features as if searching for the boy he'd met a decade ago. "You walked in those shoes," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and pride. "Didn't you?" Malik nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "All the way." They stepped outside after the class ended, the sun dipping behind a line of gray buildings, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Henry leaned on the railing, his hands in his coat pockets, the tan fabric fraying at the cuffs. He looked older, yes, but not diminished, still steady, still quiet. His presence a grounding force that Malik hadn't realized he'd been missing. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of diesel from a passing bus, and the distant laughter of children echoed from a nearby playground. "I looked for you," Malik said, his voice breaking the silence. "For years. I needed to thank you." Henry shrugged, his shoulders hunching slightly, as if the weight of Malik's gratitude was too much to bear. "You just did," he said simply, his voice rough but warm. But Malik shook his head, his hands clenching at his sides. "It's not enough." He took a deep breath, the words spilling out like a dam breaking. He told Henry everything. The job at Stridewell, the promotions that had come one after another, the Reclaim Rack program that had redistributed hundreds of shoes, the Step Forward line with purpose stitched into every seam. And when he mentioned the name Step Forward, Henry's breath caught, his hand rising to cover his mouth like he'd heard something sacred. "You built all that over a pair of patched shoes?" he murmured, his voice trembling with awe. Malik smiled, a small, bittersweet smile that carried the weight of a decade. "No, I built it because someone believed in me when I couldn't afford to believe in myself." Henry was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight glowed orange against the gray. Then he turned to Malik, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't have family, Malik," he said quietly. "Never did. Never stayed anywhere long enough to make one." Malik didn't hesitate, the words coming as naturally as breathing. "You do now," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. He invited Henry to dinner that night. A simple meal at a diner down the street. Nothing fancy, just a warm place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox playing old Motown hits. They sat across from each other, sharing a plate of fries and 2 cups of coffee that tasted more like home than anything Malik had known in years. They didn't need to speak much to understand what the moment meant. A quiet folding of one life into another, a bond forged not by blood but by belief. Afterward, Malik drove Henry to his own apartment, a modest 2-bedroom he'd worked hard to afford. The second bedroom was already made up, the bed neatly made, a small lamp casting a warm glow against the walls. "You're welcome here," Malik said, his voice steady but soft, leaving the choice in Henry's hands. Henry stood in the doorway, his tan jacket still on, his hands gripping the straps of his worn bag. He looked at the room, then at Malik, his eyes searching for something, permission, maybe, or proof that this was real. After a long, stunned silence, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right then, let's walk the path together." Henry never left. He never needed to. What began as a simple offer, a couch for a night, a warm meal, a thank you long overdue, evolved into something neither of them dared name at first, but both came to understand fully. The second bedroom became his, a quiet space that was half workshop, half retreat. Malik set up proper lighting, a sturdy workbench, and ordered the finest leather he could source, the kind Henry had once dreamed of working with in his shop on 63rd. He made sure the radio always had static-free jazz playing in the background, the notes of Miles Davis and Ella Fitzgerald filling the apartment with a warmth that felt like family. There was no ceremony, no announcement, only a natural rhythm that grew between them. Mornings were spent with coffee and folded newspapers, Malik reading the business section while Henry scanned the obituaries, a quiet habit he never explained, but Malik understood. Afternoons were for slow walks through the neighborhood, stopping at local shelters to drop off repaired shoes or just to talk to the residents, many of whom reminded Malik of himself at 23. Evenings found them elbow-deep in rubber soles and old memories, Henry teaching Malik the art of stitching leather, his hands guiding Malik's with a patience that spoke of years of practice. Henry found purpose again, not just in patching shoes, but in patching people's dignity, one stitch at a time. Word of his work spread through the community like wildfire. Teachers sent in bags of student sneakers, their soles worn from playground games. A firefighter brought in a pair of boots his father had worn in the 70s, the leather cracked, but the memories intact. Henry fixed them all, his hands steady despite the tremor that had begun to creep into his fingers, a sign of age he refused to acknowledge. Malik made sure the work continued, setting up a small network of drop-off points around the city, ensuring that Henry's craft reached as many people as possible. One night, with no music, no audience, just the two of them sharing leftover stew in the kitchen, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and the quiet hum of the fridge, Malik looked across the table. The light above cast soft shadows on Henry's face, highlighting the lines of a life hard-lived, the silver in his hair catching the glow. "I want to make it official," Malik said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I want you to be my father." Henry froze, his spoon paused midair, a drop of stew clinging to the edge. He didn't speak for a long time, his gray eyes searching Malik's face as if looking for a reason to say no. Then, in a voice low and almost shaking, he said, "You sure about that, son?" Malik just nodded, his own eyes glistening. "It already is. Paper just makes it true." A week later, the adoption was legal. Malik Evans, son of Henry Brooks. From that day on, Henry introduced him not as the kid who found him or a friend from the city, but as "my boy," pride in every syllable. With Henry by his side, Malik's vision grew beyond anything he'd imagined. He founded Henry's Haven, a non-profit network of community stations in underserved neighborhoods, where anyone could get free shoes or learn to repair them. Volunteers, trained by Henry or his mints, carried forward the message, no one is too broken to stand tall again. At the Step Forward line launch, Malik stood before investors, press, and community leaders, not in a suit, but in the same shirt from his first interview, holding up the shoes Henry had repaired a decade ago. "The day these shoes were stitched together," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, I realized it wasn't just the leather that needed fixing. I didn't need a job. I needed someone to believe I was worth keeping together. Henry didn't give me a handout. He gave me a reason to keep walking. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause, not polite, but raw, real, echoing with something deeper than brand loyalty. That evening, Malik skipped the after-party. He went home, where Henry sat on a bench Malik had built from old warehouse pallets, a mug of coffee in hand, watching neighborhood kids play. Malik knelt beside a boy, showing him how to tie his laces tight. Henry watched, a quiet smile on his face. The same smile from that first day, when he'd pulled a needle through a broken soul. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He sipped his coffee, light spilling onto his face. A father not by blood, but by a turning point, the kind you carry forever. What's your shoe moment? A small act of kindness that changed your path? Share it in the comments. We'd love to hear how someone's belief in you made a difference. Let's reflect on the power of compassion together. This story of Malik and Henry reminds us that resilience, kindness, and the courage to pay it forward can transform lives. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to bringing you impactful tales that inspire and uplift, but we need your help to keep going. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support can make it happen. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and join our community today. Time's ticking, and these stories are too powerful to miss. Let's walk this path of inspiration together.